This isn't your home anymore.
My stepmom kicked me out of my childhood home, telling me, "This isn't your home anymore." She was right, so I stopped paying the property taxes for it. I, 32 EM, had been secretly covering the $73,000 bill for 9 years to keep my dad from losing the house. Now it was his problem, and the bill was due. My relationship with my father had always been complicated, but what happened over the past few months pushed me to a breaking point I didn't know existed. My mother passed away when I was 19. Cancer took her quickly, and it left my father and me in this strange limbo of grief. The house we lived in, a modest 3-bedroom place in the suburbs, became our shared anchor. Dad wasn't great with finances, he never had been. Mom handled all of that when she was alive. And after she died, things got messy fast. By the time I was 23 and working my first real job after college, I discovered Dad was drowning in property tax debt. The house was going to be seized if someone didn't step in. So I did. I took over the property taxes. Not officially. The deed was still in his name, but I paid them every year without fail for 9 years. It wasn't cheap, but it was my childhood home. And, more importantly, it was all Dad left of Mom. I couldn't let him lose it. Dad and I had an understanding. I lived in my old bedroom, the one I'd had since I was a kid, and contributed to household expenses. He appreciated it, or at least I thought he did. We weren't particularly close after Mom died. Grief does strange things to people, but we coexisted peacefully enough. Then about a year ago, Dad started dating someone. Her name isn't important. What matters is that 6 months ago, they got married and she moved in with her 2 teenage kids. I was cautiously optimistic at first. Dad seemed happier, and I genuinely wanted that for him. I told him I was glad he found someone, and I meant it. The problem started almost immediately after the wedding. She made it clear from day one that she didn't like me being there. It was subtle at first, comments about how I should be living on my own at my age. Suggestions that I was taking up space her kids needed. I brushed it off initially. Blending families is hard, I told myself. Give it time. But the comments got sharper. She'd make snide remarks about my schedule, about the fact that I worked from home sometimes, about how I used the kitchen. Her kids, meanwhile, were loud and entitled, treating the house like a hotel. They'd leave messes everywhere, blast music at all hours, and act like I was the intruder. Dad didn't say much. He'd gotten passive in his old age, always trying to keep the peace. Whenever I brought up issues, he'd just tell me to be patient, that everyone was adjusting. 3 months ago, things came to a head. I came home from running errands one Saturday afternoon to find her standing in the hallway outside my bedroom. She had this look on her face. Smug, almost triumphant. She told me we needed to talk. I asked, what about, and she launched into this speech about how her daughter needed my room because it was bigger and had better lighting, and her son needed his own space, too. So, they were going to take over the guest room. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. When none came, I told her that wasn't going to happen. This was my room, had been for over a decade, and I wasn't going anywhere. That's when she said it. Her voice went cold, and she looked me dead in the eye and told me this isn't my home anymore. She said I was a grown man leeching off my father, and it was time I figured out my own life instead of squatting in a house that didn't belong to me. I felt something snap inside me. Not anger, exactly, more like clarity. This woman who had been in this house for all of 6 months was trying to erase me from the one place that still connected me to my mother. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just told her fine. She looked surprised, like she'd expected more of a fight. She asked if I was serious, and I confirmed that I was. I said I'd be out by the end of the month. She seemed pleased with herself, like she'd won some great victory. Dad wasn't home during this conversation. When he got back that evening, she'd already told him I'd agreed to move out. He came to my room looking uncomfortable and asked if we could talk. I told him his wife had made her position clear, and I wasn't going to stay where I wasn't wanted. He tried to backtrack, said maybe we could work something out, but I could see he wasn't going to stand up to her. He'd chosen his new family, and that was that. I spent the next 2 weeks apartment hunting. I found a decent one-bedroom place about 20 minutes away. It wasn't cheap, but I could afford it. While I was packing, I started thinking about everything I'd put into that house over the years, not just emotionally, but financially. The property taxes had been my burden for nearly a decade. I'd never asked Dad to pay me back because it felt like the right thing to do at the time. He was my father, and I was helping him keep Mom's memory alive. But now it felt different. I started pulling records, bank statements, tax documents, receipts. I'd kept everything because I'm meticulous about finances. Over 9 years, I'd paid just over $73,000 in property taxes. The amount shocked even me when I calculated it. I reached out to a lawyer friend to understand my options. He told me that since the deed was in Dad's name and there was no formal agreement, I likely couldn't get that money back. But, he added, there was nothing stopping me from simply ceasing payment. I asked what would happen if I stopped paying. He explained that the county would start sending notices to the property owner, my father, about unpaid taxes. If those went ignored long enough, penalties would accrue, and eventually the county could place a lien on the property or even initiate foreclosure proceedings. The gears in my head started turning. I moved out on a Wednesday. Dad helped me carry some boxes to my car, and the whole thing was awkward and sad. His wife watched from the doorway with her arms crossed, making no effort to hide her satisfaction. Her kids had already started moving their stuff into my old room before I'd even finished loading my car. Dad told me to stay in touch, and I said I would, but we both knew things had fundamentally changed between us. The following week, I contacted the county tax office. I explained that I'd been making payments on someone else's property and wanted to remove my bank account from their automatic payment system. The clerk was helpful and processed the request immediately. I asked when the next tax bill would be due, and she told me it had actually just been issued. Payment was due in 45 days. I didn't tell Dad. I figured if he was going to let his wife push me out, he could handle his own responsibilities. The first notice arrived at his house about 6 weeks later. I know because Dad called me sounding confused. He said he'd gotten something from the county about unpaid property taxes and asked if I knew anything about it. I told him I'd stopped making payments when I moved out. There was a long silence on the other end. He asked why I hadn't said anything. I reminded him that I'd been paying his property taxes for 9 years without him once acknowledging it or offering to contribute. I told him I'd shouldered that burden because I wanted to help, but circumstances had changed. He was building a new life with his new family, and I was no longer part of that equation. He tried to argue that I'd never told him I was paying the taxes. I felt my temper flare at that. I asked him how he thought the taxes were getting paid all these years, especially given how bad his finances were after Mom died. Had he really never questioned it, or had he just chosen not to think about it because it was convenient? He got quiet. Eventually, he said he'd figure it out and hung up. 2 weeks later, he called again. This time, he sounded panicked. He said the bill was higher than he thought. Apparently, penalties had already started accruing because the payment was late. He asked if I could help him out just this once. I asked if his wife knew about the situation. He admitted she did. I asked what she thought, and he went silent again before saying she felt it was my responsibility since I'd been handling it before. That's when I laughed. Not a happy laugh, a bitter, exhausted one. I told Dad that his wife had made it abundantly clear I had no place in that house and no claim to anything related to it. She'd said it wasn't my home anymore, so the financial obligations that came with it weren't mine anymore either. He tried to guilt me, saying I was punishing him for something his wife did. I told him he'd stood by and let her erase me from my own childhood home without saying a word in my defense. He'd chosen her comfort over his own son, and now he was dealing with the consequences of that choice. The call ended badly. We didn't speak for a month after that. During that time, I heard through a mutual friend that things at the house were getting tense. Apparently, Dad had tried to cover the tax bill himself, but didn't have nearly enough in savings. His wife had expected him to have more money set aside and was furious when she realized how precarious his financial situation actually was. They'd started fighting about money constantly. Dad reached out again about 3 months after I'd moved out. The county had sent another notice. The penalties were continuing to stack up and they were warning about potential liens. He sounded desperate. He asked if we could meet in person to talk. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. We met at a coffee shop near my old neighborhood. Dad looked like he'd aged 5 years and 3 months. He was haggarded, stressed, and defeated. He told me things at home were bad. His wife was on him constantly about the tax situation, and her kids were complaining that the house wasn't what they'd expected. Apparently, they'd assumed Dad had more money than he did. He asked, almost begging, if there was any way I could help. He said he'd made mistakes and handled things poorly, but he didn't know what else to do. I asked him if his wife had contributed anything toward the taxes. He said she'd refused, claiming it was his house and his problem. I sat back and looked at this man who I'd once idolized. My father, who'd let his new wife disrespect and discard me without a fight, was now asking me to bail him out of a mess partially of his own making. I told him I wasn't going to pay his taxes anymore. That ship had sailed, but I offered him an alternative. I'd loan him enough to cover the immediate bill and penalties at a reasonable interest rate with a formal repayment plan. Everything would be documented legally. He looked horrified. He asked how I could treat my own father like a bank. I replied that he treated me like a tenant who'd overstayed his welcome, so we were apparently doing transactional relationships now. He didn't take the loan. Pride, probably, or maybe his wife talked him out of it. Instead, I later learned he'd borrowed money from his brother, my uncle, to cover the taxes. That created a whole new set of family drama because my uncle apparently gave him an earful about how he treated me. Update 1. Things spiraled further over the next few months. Dad's marriage started cracking under the financial pressure. His wife had apparently married him thinking he was more financially stable than he was, and the reality was a harsh disappointment for her. The arguments got worse, loud enough that neighbors started noticing. Her kids, meanwhile, had destroyed my old room. I heard this from my uncle who'd gone to visit Dad. They'd punched holes in the walls, stained the carpet, and generally trashed the space. The room that had once been my sanctuary, filled with memories of my mother, was now a disaster zone. Dad reached out periodically, usually when things got particularly bad at home. He'd hint at regrets, say things like how he missed the way things used to be, but he never quite apologized. Not really. It was always vague acknowledgments that mistakes were made without taking ownership. I stayed firm. I'd built a life in my new apartment. It was smaller, and I was paying rent now instead of just utilities and property taxes, but it was mine. No one could tell me to leave. No one could make me feel unwelcome in my own space. About 7 months after I moved out, Dad called, sounding different, quieter, resigned. He told me his wife had filed for divorce. Apparently, the financial stress and constant fighting had been too much, and she decided she was done. She was moving out, taking her kids with her. I asked how he felt about that. He said he didn't know. Relieved, maybe, but also ashamed. He admitted he'd made terrible choices, prioritizing a woman he barely knew over his own son. And now he was alone in a house full of bad memories and mounting bills. I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching my father's life fall apart. Even after everything, I just listened. He asked if I'd consider moving back in. The house was too big for just him. He was struggling financially and he missed having me around. I told him I'd think about it, but I already knew my answer. A week later, I met him for lunch and gave him my decision. I wasn't moving back. Too much had happened and I couldn't return to a place where I'd been made to feel so unwanted, but I made him a different offer. I told him I'd help him sell the house. The market was decent, and he could probably get enough to pay off the remaining tax debt, cover my uncle's loan, and have something left over to start fresh in a smaller, more affordable place. I'd even help him with the down payment on a new place if he needed it. No strings attached. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and asked why I'd do that after everything. I told him that despite everything, he was still my father, and Mom wouldn't have wanted me to abandon him completely. But I also made it clear that our relationship moving forward would be different, more boundaried, more honest. He agreed. The house sold 3 months later. Dad moved into a small condo closer to his work, and I helped him settle in. We have dinner together once a month now. Nothing fancy, just a standing date to check in. It's not the relationship we had before Mom died, and it's certainly not what I imagined family would look like. But it's something. I learned a lot through all of this. I learned that sometimes helping people means knowing when to stop helping. I learned that respect is earned, not owed, even within families. And I learned that standing up for yourself doesn't make you cruel. It makes you honest. My old room is someone else's now in someone else's house, and that's okay. I've built new spaces, new boundaries, and new definitions of what home means. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away and let people face the consequences of their choices, including the people you love most. In the end, I'm at peace with my decision. I learned that you can't set yourself on fire to keep others warm. What would you have done in my situation? Let me know down below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories.